I want to bring into the conversation now somebody I'm honored to have with us tonight, Jeh Johnson. He's the former general counsel of the Defense Department. That means he was the former top lawyer at the Pentagon. He also, of course, was Secretary of Homeland Security under President Obama. Secretary Johnson, it is nice to see you, sir. Thank you for joining us tonight on short notice.
Rachel, nice to be back on your show. It's been a while.
It has been a while. I hope that your life has been peaceful and apolitical, as at least as much as you want it to be. But the reason that I wanted to call you tonight, sir, is because I feel like you have pretty unique experience, having been both Homeland Security Secretary and the Pentagon's top lawyer, in terms of thinking about this sort of Rubicon the president may be crossing tonight. I just want to ask your reaction to what you've learned tonight, and I want to give you a chance to correct me if I've said anything that strikes you as wrong.
Where do I start? First, small point. When the president says he's putting General Milley in charge, I'm sure that was a head turn for General Milley. General Milley is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He is, by law, the principal legal advisor to the president and the National Security Council. General Milley, with all due respect, is not in charge of anything except the joint staff bureaucracy on the second floor of the Pentagon and a few other things like the National Defense University. So, small point. Aside from that, as you pointed out, there is the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878, which generally forbids the active duty military to engage in direct domestic law enforcement. It's one of the things that makes our country great. It's an American value. It's one of the reasons why we have so much respect for our U.S. military today, because we keep them cabined in that way. The Insurrection Act of 1807, which some lawyer pulled out of the closet, has been amended over time, over the years, and it's cobbled together in various different places. But the Insurrection Act is something that empowers the president to commit the active duty force domestically, but essentially when all else has failed. It is a measure of last resort. When state governments have failed in their law enforcement mission, when state court systems have melted down, like, for example, when there is violence on the streets and states refuse to abide by a federal court order, in those types of circumstances, which are clearly not applicable here, the violence is widespread, the violence is serious, but we are not at a point, I think we're far from a point where state law enforcement, with the help of the National Guard under state control, can deal with it. I think we're a very long way off from invocation of the Insurrection Act.
If the president were to try to invoke the Insurrection Act, is every step of that within his own authority? I know that he has to, at least as far as I understand it, not as a lawyer, but he has to issue some sort of formal declaration, a sort of order telling people to disperse, giving people a chance to stop doing what they're doing, which is the basis for him potentially invoking this act. But then he could, under his own steam, just do that and thus invoke the act and thus order the military. Can stand in his way for doing this, is there?
There is a reading of the Insurrection Act that suggests that he need not wait for the states, for a governor, for a state legislature to request it. He must issue some sort of proclamation with a finding, but the circumstances here, as serious as they are not present that permit insurrection, the use of the Insurrection Act. The states have not failed in their mission. And any national security lawyer, ranging from the ACLU to the Federalist Society, will tell you that, who's worth a darn, frankly.
In terms of the way the president sort of rolled out this concept tonight, as I was just discussing with Courtney Kuby, there's a lot of ambiguity as to what the president, not just what he means, but what he has done, including there seems to be at the Pentagon no real sense of what authority the president is invoking now or planning to. Can I just ask you, having served as a cabinet secretary, having served in the capacity that you did in the Defense Department, What do you expect from the Defense Department right now? What do you expect from the military with the president making these kinds of public statements and talking about soldiers being used in the way that he talked about tonight? Is this a situation where we should expect either civilian appointees or senior uniformed members of the military to stand up and have to say no to the president?
Rachel, that's a very good question. Frankly, if I think Jim Mattis were still Secretary of Defense, we'd see real pushback to this. I cannot speak to the current Secretary of Defense because I do not know him. I do know a whole lot of civilian and military lawyers in the Pentagon right now who understand the implications of the invocation of the Insurrection Act and know its proper application. And that's across the spectrum from all sorts of lawyers I know in national security. And so normally when you do something like this and you issue a military order to deploy the active duty, there's a lot of planning. There are rules of engagement that go into it. And military personnel down the line, down the chain of command, have to understand what they're being asked to do. You can't do this on a moment's notice without close consultation down the chain of command.
Jeh Johnson, former Defense Department General Counsel, former Secretary of Homeland Security in the Obama administration. Sir, it is an honor to have you here tonight, especially on this strange and dark day. Come back soon. It's been too long. It's nice to have you here.
Thanks, Rachel.